I wanted to talk a little about Belt and Road, and I know we'll talk more about this in the conversation. But I just wanted to highlight here that there's sort of myth and reality, right? And for right now, Belt and Road is pretty much everything and nothing at the same time. So I spend a lot of time in the book kind of clarifying what it is, what it isn't. But to cut to the chase, it doesn't play out the same way in every country. There's this notion that, well, here's a string of Chinese debt traps. China's heavily indebting poor countries to build infrastructure they don't need. And when they default on their debt, it's going to take control of their economies. Open and shut case. British East India Company is back, right? That's more or less the kind of caricature. It's not true. That's just not the way it really is. There are poor countries that are caught in debt traps. A lot of those countries already had very high outstanding debt to China, which is kind of our fault because we cut them out of global capital markets. They don't have sovereign credit ratings. We've not been lending to them. So who are they going to borrow from? From China at usurious, non-concessional interest rates, right? I argue throughout in this book, if you want to have, it's sort of a sequel to my connectography book, which was sort of the prequel to this, saying, you can't have influence if you're not connected. You can only influence what you're connected to. So if we just sit back and say, shame on you, don't take Chinese money, that's not the way it works. You want to be influenced, you got to go and put your own money. Put your money where your mouth is this sort of schoolyard adage that is incredibly appropriate for diplomacy in the 21st century. Because, of course, power abhors a vacuum, right? If you don't go in there, if you don't help these countries, of course someone else is going to. And that said, though, the British East India Company analogies fail in many ways because this is not the 18th century. Today we have sovereignty, we have transparency, we have democracy, we have scrutiny over everything that China does. And if this were a colonial world or a neo-colonial world, then you wouldn't see countries saying no and ripping up deals with China. And that's what's happening all the time, right? Malaysia decided to cancel a railway project. Myanmar has forced China into a write-down on its debt. Other countries are saying no to Chinese acquisition of large stakes in utilities and strategic sectors. It's so funny. When we sit here and we look at China, we see an empire with a 1,000-year plan that always gets what it wants and will stop at nothing to displace America and to be number one. If I were in Beijing right now as a Chinese leader, I'd be pulling my hair out. I'd be pouting, saying, no, I never get what I want. All these countries are ripping up contracts with me and they're kicking me out, and my construction engineers are being thrown down mine shafts and shot in the head and kidnapped, and I'm having to take a haircut on all this debt, and so on and so on and so on. So this is the reality is somewhere in between. And it plays out differently in every country, and I just wanted to show, and we can talk through a few examples in a little bit, but no two countries fall into the exact same pattern in how Belt and Road will play out. But the message here is that geopolitics is nonlinear, and I just want to give the example of Sri Lanka, right? Because the Sri Lanka example is one that we all read about. When the Sri Lankans were close to default on the Hambantota port, which they didn't need and was too expensive, they were sort of coerced, if you will, into a debt for equity swap. China gained a 99-year lease on the port. So many people in our kind of analytic community looked at that and said, here it is, the first domino to fall, right? The first of many debt traps across the entire Indian Ocean region. And yet, I think that was the first and the last. Because what happened is that the next day, all of the cabinets of countries around this region got together and said, how do we avoid becoming the next Sri Lanka? And so they did. Right? They said, uh-oh, no $60 billion worth of projects with China. This is what Pakistan said. Let's cut that down to below $30 billion and let's make sure it's sustainable debt. Right? And others said, let's just not do this project altogether. And China is absorbing this. Right? The ambitions of the plan are being dramatically reduced. So again, non-linear. Geopolitics is non-linear. It's not just action, it's reaction. There's feedback loops to everything.